Hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of the new National Climate Assessment Roundtable series. My name is Larry Perez with the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program in Fort Collins, Colorado. And right off the bat, I want to let you know that today's roundtable is being live captioned with the kind assistance of Fed Relay. So for anyone attending that wants to take advantage of captioning, just use the link that we're about to share now in the chat window below to get access to that. The Roundtable series that you're taking part of now is intended to deliver area-specific information to units of the National Park System in each of the 10 National Climate Assessment regions. Roundtables are really great opportunities to learn about the latest findings from that assessment, ask questions from subject matter experts that had a hand in formulating that assessment, and have a real dialogue with NPS leaders that are actively working on climate change issues in their parks. So during today's call, we really encourage your participation along the way. Today's roundtable will focus squarely on parks within the Pacific Islands region of the assessment. If you happen to be calling in from a region outside Pacific Islands, that's okay. We still very much encourage your participation. Just be aware that both previous and subsequent installments of this roundtable series will focus on additional regions of the National Climate Assessment around the country. Recordings of all past events and a full schedule of upcoming events can all be found using the link that we're going to go ahead and post in the chat box again down below now. As part of today's call, we'll be hearing momentarily from Dr. David Helweg on findings, impacts, and actions from the 4th National Climate Assessment, followed by a brief question and answer session. Then we'll have short presentations from several invited guests from parks in the Pacific Islands region. And we're hoping to conclude the broadcast promptly today at 12:30 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. I'm going to be one of two facilitators on today's roundtable, so I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Mr. Matt Hawley, who's going to be helping us manage the technology in the background today. And speaking of the tech, a few quick words about that before we begin. Be aware that all the functionality of this webinar is accessed through the tiny toolbar in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If the webinar panels are not already visible, you can go ahead and access them by clicking on the right arrow button at the very top of the toolbar. Just be aware that your panels may minimize periodically by default, but you can set them to remain open by clicking on the View tab at the very top of the menu and deselecting the Auto Hide control panel option that's there. Additionally, within your webinar interface, you have an audio panel. That audio panel shows how you're currently connected to the webinar. For best quality, we always recommend that you dial in via phone rather than using computer audio. So if you're currently connected via computer audio, you are welcome to switch over to phone audio right now at this time and dial in using the phone number that's actually provided to you within that same panel. We have quite a number of participants on the line with us today, so by default, all participants are muted just to keep background noise in check. We will, though, be taking questions during the entirety of this roundtable. Again, these roundtables are really prime opportunities to ask questions of our invited experts and practitioners relative to the impacts and challenges that you're facing in your own parks. So we really welcome you to bring your voice into the room, and there are two ways to do that today. If you have a question that you want to ask using your voice during the webinar, simply find the Raise Your Hand button in the webinar interface, and we will unmute you one by one to ask your questions verbally. And just so everyone gets familiar with that functionality and has a chance to push the button, everyone that can hear my voice, go ahead and raise your hand right now.
The hands are going up, Larry.
All right.
Coming in fast.
Coming in hot?
Yes. Look at all those green hands.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Feel free to use that raise your hand feature at any time. Matt will go ahead and lower your hands from his perch in the captain's chair. In addition to asking questions verbally, you're welcome to submit questions in writing at any time. To do so, just find the questions panel at the very bottom of your interface as you see here. Matt and I are going to be monitoring for incoming questions, and we'll pose them to our panelists and presenters as time permits. Additionally, should you have any issues with the technology today, you can use this same questions panel to let Matt and I know in the background. With that, I'd like to go ahead and kick things off. And I'd like to introduce the Chief of the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program, Kath Hawkins Hoffman, to say a few words to kick us off on this roundtable. Kath?
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Larry. So I've been looking forward to this all day. We're sitting here in Colorado. It's been snowing all day. We probably have 6 or 8 or 10 inches, I don't know. So to have this particular webinar on this snowy day is fantastic. So I'm really looking forward to it. And I want to be brief, but I mainly wanted to really thank our speakers, so Dave and Jade, and then our panelists. Mike, I don't believe I've met you before, but I certainly know Ryan and Melia and Stanton. Really appreciate your time, and we look forward to your presentations. And then the last thing is simply to invite everyone to be very interactive in the webinar. We have intentionally focused these chapter sessions on the parks within the area, which makes sense, of course, but also we're trying to make this an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you have broadly about climate change or about the regional chapter itself. So I encourage you to submit questions early and often. We have found in other webinars that people tend to wait towards the end before they send in their questions, by which time we're often running out of time. So thanks again to the speakers, and please send your questions in. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. I appreciate that. And at this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our featured speaker this afternoon. Dr. Helweg is Senior Liaison for Insular Relations in the U.S. Geologic Survey National Climate Adaptation Science Center. Dr. Helweg leads the development of methodologies to conduct scientific strategic initiatives, developing partnerships, and identifying the key science support needs of the U.S. Department of Interior Office of Insular Affairs and partner organizations in the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands and U.S. Virgin Islands. He develops working partnerships that produce science products in support of the mission of the Office of Insular Affairs to provide technical assistance to the territories of American Samoa, Guam, the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, as well as the freely associated states of the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau under the Compacts of Free Association. Dave, it's an absolute privilege to have you online with us today. Thank you for taking time to join us. We're going to pass the baton to you and let you take it away for a minute.
Yeah, Dave, you should see I went ahead and made you the presenter. You'll just have to accept the ball, as it were.
I just did. I
Looks good, Dave. We see
I
your
just accepted.
PowerPoint.
Are you seeing my screen?
We are.
Yes. Good. Well, aloha, folks, and National Park Service for this opportunity to talk with y'all about the production of the National Climate Assessment and some of the implications. It's been wonderful working with Larry and his team to get this set up. If we're ready, I'll begin my talk. Larry, are we good to go?
Yeah, that looks good, Dave. Go for it.
Okay. So today I'll be speaking with you about National Climate Assessment, and I'm chasing the webinar panel around on my screen. Forgive me. I'll introduce the National Climate Assessment. I'll describe a few key scientific concepts I think is just very important to bear in mind for our Pacific Islands region. Then I'll describe in some detail the outcomes of the National Climate Assessment for our islands, including the key messages, and whenever possible, I'll drill down to give examples relevant to the Park Service in the region. And then I'd like to point out a few sample projects that will be hopefully interesting to our audience, and then key takeaways. So to start, the National Climate, the fourth National Climate Assessment was released on Black Friday, November 2018. It's policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. There's a strong emphasis on regional information and risk framing, so that's the regional emphasis. Impacts are quantified in economic terms whenever possible. It attempted to integrate international considerations, so it isn't just a standalone US product. There was a range of potential impacts that were assessed, which rather than just presenting one potential impact, a range is usually better for people who are making decisions, because then they can weigh options. And finally, it uses case studies to provide context. In this presentation, I'm going to touch briefly on the science in volume 1, and then the Hawaii Pacific chapter, as it indicates here on the slide, is in volume 2. So the regional chapters, were the structure was highlighted at the beginning of Larry's introduction. It's important because the messages were determined by regional risks. So this wasn't just a national panel or international panel that put our risks and challenges in that context, but instead were determined by our stakeholders. And the chapters highlight the options, challenges, opportunities, and success stories. So we link climate trends, which may be global in nature of the science, to regional risks, and we assessed future climate change relevant to those regional risks. And I think perhaps this is probably fairly familiar to most of you on this webinar, but the legitimacy and the salience, the key to this was through stakeholder engagement and participation. And here's some factoids for you. There was a sectorial survey that was done by the Pacific RISA, led by Victoria Keener, that was emailed out. Everybody on the going into the chapter, and a team of people pooled our emails of everybody we knew, and we sent this survey out asking people to identify which sectors, and a sector would, for example, would be freshwater, coastal vulnerability, agriculture and forestry, and so on. Asking them which ones they thought were most important to include in this chapter. Webinars were held in October 2016. There were 35 participants in those webinars describing the process and encouraging people to engage. Sectoral workshops were held in March 2017 over a period of 2 days. There was a Honolulu town hall. At the same time, there were 70 participants. There was a Guam satellite town hall in April of 2017 with about 40 participants. And in the end, there were 11 volunteer authors. And in total, from the beginning of the process through to the end, through contributions to stakeholder engagement at the beginning, all the way through to writing and reviews, over 350 people engaged in our chapter. So I'm going to shift gears now and talk a little science. We're heading towards the Hawaii Pacific chapter as I'm going here, but I want to touch on just two particular scientific points. And the first is the concept of the difference and the interaction of climate variability versus long-term climate change. And there's a very good treatment of this in the 4th assessment, volume 1. You can see the online link here. Chapter 5 describes large-scale circulation, which are large patterns of flow in the atmosphere and the ocean, and climate variability. And one of the key takeaways in this chapter 5 is for the Pacific Basin, our climate variability is primarily related to the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And for the folks on the phone today who have been working in the Pacific region, this isn't a surprise at all. We all pay careful attention on a month-by-month basis sometimes to the El Nino conditions in the Pacific Island region. And the importance of this is that the El Nino magnitudes, the variability induced by El Nino or La Nina state, can actually obscure long-term climate trends over the short term. This figure is taken directly from the Hawaii Pacific Islands chapter of the National Climate Assessment one of the best descriptions of El Nino and La Nina variability that we have. I need to check in now. My computer is, okay, my computer was telling me that audio.
David, you still with us?
Larry, do we have audio?
Yep, we hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. My computer just said the audio was lost. Okay, in the Hawaii Pacific chapter, we have this figure of the El Nino and La Nina states. El Nino is in the top panel and La Nina is the bottom. Again, it's the main source of year-to-year variability in climate conditions. And for the El Nino in the top panel, is characterized by heat waves in the summer. You can see wet and dry, wet is in blue and dry is in brown conditions. Drought in January through March, drier and warmer at tree line in Hawaii. So that's particularly relevant to Havo and Hale, those parks. You can see very small images of cyclones, those little spinning discs by Hawaii, Samoa, the Marshalls, and out into Micronesia. More cyclones and lower than average sea levels in the areas that are crosshatched, the blue stripes. So lower sea levels in the Western Pacific. And in contrast, during an El Nino year, it is pretty much the inverse of that. Wet in the December-February timeframe in Hawaii and some portions of the Western Pacific, and average to high sea levels in the hatched areas, and fewer tropical cyclones. And again, the magnitudes of this variability are often larger than climate change over short time scales. And I would say, that's a decade or two. And this means that the impacts are more immediate to leadership and natural resource managers who have to pay attention to things like to manage for drought, manage for high sea levels, and so on. Importantly, long-term change, seasonal changes, tides, weather, and so on are compounded. So you may have, for example, as sea levels may be rising over multiple decades with sea level rise, you also may be adding on higher than normal sea states to create king tides and so on. And at the time of the National Climate Assessment, the fourth, it was unclear how ENSO would change, whether or if it would. It's fairly well established that it will continue, but whether the magnitude will remain, whether the periodicity, how often El Nino appears will remain, and so on, is not well established at this point in time. But I'm going to leave this slide now, and the takeaway is that I know for resource managers who are managing units out on the landscape, managing for El Nino is important, but El Nino changes over multiple decades will add to long-term changes. So you can't one shouldn't just disregard the long-term changes. And here's a complicated and busy slide. This is my second scientific point, and it's about storminess. And there has been some modeling of future tropical cyclones in the Pacific. And on the left-hand panels, on the top is the frequency of the birth, the genesis frequency, the birth of cyclones. You can see on the bottom, there's the outline of Australia. It runs all the way up to the top. Is the outline of Japan, and you can see kind of a diamond-shaped red figure. That's where Hawaii is. And let's continue to the right here. The genesis, the birth, the frequency of cyclone birth in the region for a predicted climate change with some greenhouse gas mitigation there was some mixed results. But if we look on the far right panel, if this was the business as usual model, the genesis frequency at RCP 8.5, and the important takeaway for this, and these are models, so these are projections. Knowing what we know when this was created back in 2014 and 2015. But by the end of the century, this modeling run predicted a decrease in the genesis of tropical cyclones in the Guam region and an increase in the genesis of cyclones in the Hawaii region and perhaps towards the Marshalls. And this was related to the warming of the waters around Hawaii. The bottom set of panels is the occurrence, so not the birth, but the occurrence of cyclones. And again, it's not a surprise if we look in the left-hand panel, you can see a very dense blue splash of color, and we know that's Typhoon Alley over in between Guam and Okinawa and that part of the world. If we look all the way over to the right, you can see a panel with many blue stars and many red stars. And under the business as usual climate change modeling, that was with no greenhouse gas mitigation. By the end of the century, the modeling made it clear that it was predicted that there would be significantly fewer cyclones or tropical cyclones in Cyclone Alley out in the Guam and Philippine Sea region, and more in Hawaii. Now, I do again offer this caveat that this is modeling. We'll need to measure and cross-check these models as they're developed in the coming years. But this is an interesting finding for people managing the parks, especially in the Western Pacific, if this trend actually continues to have a decrease in the number of tropical cyclones. And the findings were not significant, but it is worth reporting that the intensity of these cyclones did not decline. So there may be fewer, but intensity will be high, if not higher. Okay, so shifting gears and going on our deep dive into the National Climate Assessment in Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific Islands. And this map is an overview of the region that was covered in this chapter. It runs from Hawaii and Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, down to NIPSA, down to the parks and the refuges in American Samoa, and the remote refuge complex, westing to the freely associated states of the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau, and then the Marianas, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. And in this region, we have these parks in Hawaii. I put Honouliuli in small letters. It's in its infancy, but this is the parks that would be part of this assessment. And in the Western Pacific, or in outside of the state of Hawaii, we have Ami and Saipan, Wapa and Guam, and then the NIPSA on the three islands of American Samoa, Tutuila, Ofu, and Ta'u. I referred at the beginning of my talk about sending out a survey to determine which sectors would be covered in the Hawaii and the Pacific Islands, and these are the six. The cumulative impacts were given to all of the regional chapters. But for Hawaii, the survey respondents, based on the survey respondents, the most important sectors of concern were water supplies, ecosystems and biodiversity, coastal systems, ocean and marine resources, and indigenous communities. And while it may not be highly relevant to the National Park Service folks on the phone on this webinar today, ecosystems and biodiversity was closely tied with agriculture and forestry. to be included. And a literature review showed there was almost no literature on the impacts of climate change on ag and forestry in our region. And so we wouldn't have been able to include it. In my next slide, I'm going to go through the key messages one by one, and then we'll dig in. So in summary, for freshwater, the key message was freshwater supplies for communities, and that's human communities, and ecosystems are threatened. Key message 2, climate change threatens terrestrial ecosystems, species, and ecosystem services. Key message 3, sea level rise will increasingly impact coastal infrastructure, transportation, ecosystems, and human communities. Key message 4, rising ocean temperatures and acidification threaten fisheries, coral reefs, and the livelihoods they support. Key message 5, climate change affects the health, well-being, and modern livelihoods of Indigenous peoples of the Pacific. And finally, key message 6, which is the compounding of impacts. Compounding impacts means that early intervention and adaptations will be more effective. So let's dig in. Key message 2, climate change threatens inland terrestrial ecosystems, species, and services. This figure is the modeled number of native Hawaiian forest birds. On the top panel for current conditions, and the bottom panel for projected for the end of century for 2100, the last decade of 2100. And if you look at this, the more species there are, the darker the coloration. And you can see in the contemporary conditions in the top panel, there are some swaths of what may just look like dark patches on your map. Those are the number of species per unit, per pixel. And the important message for this figure is if you look down and look, for example, compare the Big Island in contemporary conditions on the top with projected conditions, there are far fewer native bird species per pixel by the end of the century. So in Hawaii, 90% of native terrestrial species are endemic. And in the main Hawaiian Islands, there's over 1,000 native species, and scientific estimates published predict that by 2100, by the end of the century, over 350 of these species will no longer be in their optimal range, as the climate change will have either extinguished their habitat or those conditions will have moved based on warming and rainfall patterns. For the coastal and marine nearshore communities, climate change threatens coastal ecosystems, species, and services. And these are two images of East Island and Papahanaumokuakea. And on the left is May 2018. You can see East Island, the sandy area. And on the right, you can see that same pixel. These are sources from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and you can see there's almost no terrestrial, there's no land above the waterline at this time. And this is a tidal event. But the important message for the parks is that sea level rise and extreme storm events will affect terrestrial habitat for seabirds, and so they'll be using these for nesting and fledging, and haul outs for turtles and seals. And you can see it's intuitive for us in the islands. The connectivity between the ocean and inland resources is immediate. The impacts are felt very quickly, and they're very extensive. Key message 3, sea level rise will increasingly impact coastal infrastructure, transportation, ecosystems, and communities. And the figure shows a panel. On the top panel, you can see the sea level rise, predicted criteria, predicted change. We're a little bit after the year 2000. And where you see the colored lines, those are different climate, those are different RCP scenarios. So the red is the business as usual. That's with no greenhouse gas mitigation. And down below that are different scenarios of how sea level may rise if greenhouse gases are mitigated and reduced. And the bottom panel shows the change in relative sea, the projected change, and you can see around the main Hawaiians especially, and then in a few places in the Pacific Islands, we're predicted to have up to about a meter of sea level rise, or 2 in the worst case for the end of by the end of the century. And the science indicates that the rate of sea level rise is accelerating, but the ultimate timing and magnitude is uncertain. And if you look at those curves in the top panel, the modeling projects sea level rise to accelerate strongly after mid-century. So right now it's not rising at the rate that's at its highest rate, according to the computer models. And of course, the impacts for us include coastal erosion, flooding, storm surge, inundation, and saltwater intrusion, both through the substrate and intrusion into aquifers. And of course, park units with coastal acreage may be vulnerable, and it depends on how high they are above the mean high tide line, and whether they have armoring like a natural infrastructure like reefs that are helping to break waves and so on. Key message 4, rising ocean temperatures and acidification threaten coral reefs and the livelihoods they support. This figure indicates a depiction of some modeling that was done on the status of reefs in our region, and the risk of the loss of the reef cover. Coral reefs add, in economic terms, approximately 364 million in goods and service annually, and that's just in Hawaii. Some factoids: the 2015 bleaching event resulted in a 50% mortality in Western Hawaii. And this is a really depressing, climate change can be really daunting to work with. And this is one that is really challenging. During that bleaching event, there were over 90% coral loss in Jarvis Island, which is a pristine island in the remote refuge complex. So not even pristine conditions could protect those reefs. And for those of you who manage reef resources, this figure indicates, this is drawn from this figure, that by 2040, our reefs are projected to be bleaching annually. And that is a very concerning prediction. Shifting gears into how the climate change and how it may affect Indigenous peoples of the Pacific. Key message 5, climate change affects the health, well-being, and modern livelihoods of Indigenous peoples of the Pacific. This is in great part because of a cultural heritage of strong interconnectedness of the cultures and the communities with the environment. And just to give a list from Hawaii, sea level rise impacts agriculture, coastal communities, food security, livelihoods, disaster management, and cultural practices. And in Hawaii, two cultural practice examples would include salt cultivation on the island of Kauai and a fish pond stewardship across the main islands. Key message 6, compounding. I didn't put in a figure here. I think the text bullets are most descriptive. Because of our compact landscapes in the islands, compounding the impacts of climate change amplifies the risks on our small and isolated islands. recovery becomes increasingly difficult because of this knock-on or these ripples of impact. Repeated shocks amplify environmental stressors. So we know those folks on the phone who are managing natural or cultural resources in the parks know that climate change is hardly the only stressor on your system. You've got invasive species, weather, storms, other anthropogenic impacts, and so on. And climate change just exacerbate or amplify these existing stressors. And for the National Climate Assessment, this was a very societal exercise, and the impacts with the largest uncertainty were how climate change would impact public health, mental health, human migration, national security, and conflict in the region. And hopes to induce a smile in the audience. Anybody who's been living on Oahu in recent weeks, we can think of how hot it's been, and just the continual grind of living in a place where with really highly elevated air temperatures and trying to stay cool and doing our jobs. So we hear in our stakeholder engagement across the Western Pacific that people out in the islands are also complaining about just being unusually hot and trying to cope with it. So the human health sector is going to potentially affect your visitors in the park units and people's experience. And perhaps the most important result for the folks on the phone is it was very clear that early action, not waiting until things may be potentially irreversible, but early action and working with communities, social cohesion. So working with stakeholders, working to get buy-in if you don't have necessarily buy-in on the concept of climate change affecting the parks, and building those communities will help to increase climate resilience. So a few quick examples in our parks. Again, just to indicate the parks I'm referring to. In Hawaii Volcanoes National Parks, there was a study done where the scientists were challenged to use the best available climate science. These were people in the Pacific Island Climate Change Cooperative, the U.S. Geological Survey, University of Hawaii, and the Forest, the Fish and Wildlife Service, who worked closely with Rhonda Lowe in Hawaii Volcanoes to try and make predictions about the future of plant species in special ecological areas. And the basic question was managers seek to know where habitats will shift with changing rainfall and temperature. And the current SEA is the preserves may not be suitable for listed species in the future. An SEA that are conditions that are favorable for a plant species now may not be, according to the climate predictions, in 100 years. And the forecast generated by the model did suggest that many of the existing SEAs in Havo will experience declines in native plant species richness due to changes in climate. And that is, of course, based on the assumption that the plants don't have the genetic or phenotypic capability to handle those change conditions. And if this webinar is available to folks after this presentation, I've included the references to each of these so y'all can get access to the reports and dig into this in more detail. In Haleakala, the silver swords, the iconic plant, has been declining in recent decades. And the findings of the most recent synthesis indicate that they continue to decline at the lower elevation portions of the park. And from all available data, this is linked to drier and warmer conditions on the mountain. The lower elevation plants seem to have growth patterns that decrease drought resistance. And that's a complicated way of saying that their below ground to above ground growth patterns that are such that they're basically outgrowing their abilities for the roots to provide moisture when unusually dry conditions are happening. The studies suggest that outplanting survival, so looking at variable survival of outplantings, does not seem to have a genetic basis. So outplanting adults from dry areas versus adults from wet areas they don't seem to produce seeds that confer greater outplanting survival. And Paul Kruselnicki at University of Hawaii at Manoa, has been the lead on this for years now. His results suggest that future outplanting efforts identify climatically suitable habitat rather than hoping to find genetically resilient ecotypes. So at the beginning of his studies, perhaps 5 to 10 years ago, I think they were hoping that the adult silver swords growing in very dry conditions would produce seeds with progeny that were drought tolerant, and there doesn't seem to be strong evidence for that. So Paul Kruselnicki and colleagues suggest that you look for climatically suitable places on the mountain for outplanting. And this is a project that has just started, and I had to include it because, in part because the imagery is just so cool. And it is just, in my mind, a superb example of a collaboration from day one between the National Park Service, resource managers, and the scientists. And this is a new study that's just starting in Pu'u Honua o Honaunau Park in South Kona, Puho. It's a study of nearshore sea level, just began this year with data collection. The top image is just a picture of the back of a van with a a bunch of equipment. And the bottom image is a 3D image of the area generated with a drone. Those data are being processed now. And the team is putting together a seamless topobathymetric. So that is from below the water line up to above the water line digital map that will allow inundation and tide modeling. And later, if more funding is acquired, will allow the wave modelers also to run their wave models right up across the water line and onto shore. And there's intensive sampling, data collection with multiple types of Earth observation, drones, survey equipment, aerial LiDAR. There's instrumentation being put in the water by Phil Thompson at the University of Hawaii Sea Level Center. That's one of NOAA's primary sea level centers, and of course the Park Service. And I encourage you to stay tuned to this. This is going to be a very interesting result. And while they were at it in August, when the team was out with the survey equipment, this park actually never had benchmarks. You know, those USGS brass markers that are put in the ground. The benchmarks that were there were never actually linked to the national standard when they were put in the 1960s. So the survey team put in some benchmarks all around that will allow the Park Service from now on to have the access to the highest accuracy mapping data. And finally, a heads up for y'all on the phone. There have been over the past few years multiple projects in the region investigating ecological drought and ecohydrology in Hawaii. In some places working intensively with National Park Service units. Those data were not ready to be included in the National Climate Assessment. So that will be coming out, I'm guessing by 2020. There will be some very interesting science connecting the ecology of Hawaiian forests and native versus non-native tree species, their reaction to drought and dry conditions, groundwater recharge, cloud water intercept, and so on. Identifying the risks of runoff and erosion in Hawaii's national parks just began. And again, the data were not analyzed and published in time for the National Climate Assessment, but this is a very good ridge to reef type connection between the status of vegetation cover and the generation of sediments that then run flow downhill during heavy rain and may impact reefs on the coast. And finally, Dr. Kurt Storlazzi in the USGS was just funded to look at climate change and sea level rise on flooding of coastal parks, and just focusing on the parks in Hawaii and the US affiliated parks in Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa. And Kurt is, I don't know if Kurt ever sleeps. And these data should be done and analyzed in a year or two. So I'm going to wrap up my talk now with the key takeaways. First, island ecosystems, human communities, and cultural practices are highly interwoven. Thus, climate change, changing climate, has multiple impacts. Climate change may render some current resource management strategies effective. And those would for example, be those such as a restoration strategy that assumes a stable physical environment. And what I mean by this, the park natural resource managers are very comfortable working with the concepts of succession, and they know that the biotic communities are almost always in a state of change, whether they're rebounding from an impact like a fire or the occurrence of a new invasive. But many of these strategies still assume that rainfall, temperature, soil moisture, things like that are going to remain relatively constant over the future, and that what is needed is during restoration is our management pushes towards the state that they want them to be in. And this may not always hold. And this may also hold for historic and cultural resources where restoration is occurring. And again, where it's assumed that sea level, storminess, and so on will be relatively constant. And that, of course, we can no longer assume under climate change. And I think in my mind, in all of the conversations and thinking I've done on this issue in the past few years, the essential question for resource managers and national and leaders in the parks and in the communities the park work with is to understand how fast climate is changing. So technically they call this climate velocity. How fast is it changing? And are the resources that I manage able to keep up? So for example, not in Hawaii, but an example in the Andes, the Andean forest tree species are moving upward with tree line at a rate of only about 2% of the rate that they need to be moving with in order to keep up with their sweet spot of rainfall and temperature. So what I'm saying is are the resources, let's say we're working up on tree line or in the cloud forest in Hawaii, in a coastal strand community in any of the islands, climate change is going to affect where the sweet spot is for those resources. And the question is whether they can move quickly enough to adapt, or whether that will have to be facilitated, and so on. And finally, from working on the National Climate Assessment, I hope that you all will take this away with you and think on it. The National Climate Assessment relies on something called traceable accounts. And essentially, any statement of what may become with a climate prediction or the status of an environmental variable must be accompanied by a peer-reviewed publication. Assertions are not, without evidence, are not included. This is why you might recall that I mentioned that agriculture and forestry weren't included, because there were no publications on the impact of climate change on ag and forestry. So the traceable accounts process makes it critical that research on climate change in the national parks get published in peer-reviewed outlets now. Because, you know, as we speak today, the National Climate Assessment 5 is underway. This happens by law every 4 years. So talks at a presentation, an abstract from a conference is not admissible. They weren't included in the NCA4. Peer-reviewed outlets, and so those would be journals and white and gray literature, which might be something like a National Park Service technical series report or a NOAA or USGS or so on, but that have gone through peer review, are essential to be included. And if you have looked through the Hawaii Pacific chapter, you'll notice that there are some noticeable gaps in it's very Hawaii centric in some areas and so on. And that was because there were so few publications from the Western Pacific that were on climate change and the resources that are managed there. And this refers not only to pure research, so research on the resources and describing not only their status and trends, but the impacts of climate on those indicators, but also publications on work based on adaptive management or co-production, learning by doing, and so on, because the National Climate Assessment emphasizes solutions and ways forward for identify important stories and case studies to talk about resilience and adaptability. So publish not only the science, but also the description of how the science and resource manager dyad work together to help improve climate resilience. And finally, the relevance to users of the parks, both biophysical and sociocultural, needs to be published. So we need to know how climate change is and could affect user experiences and get that into the literature. That's my soapbox, and I thank you for your time, and again to the Park Service for your invitation to participate.
Dave, thank you so much. What a meaty regional overview with so much to talk about and consider, and some of the work you highlighted in those case studies are just plain out cool. So thank you for that. Dave has graciously agreed to stay on the line with us into the panel session to answer any additional questions as they arise. I want to keep us on track, but as we kick off our panel discussion, I want to remind and encourage you all to send in your questions to any of our speakers as you think of them, and we'll raise them with the speakers and the panelists at the very first opportunity. So send those in using the questions panel or just raise your hand. We're happy to entertain verbal questions as well. Quick flash up of these key takeaways. We'll make these available to you after the fact via email as well. Right now, I want to introduce our panel moderator, Dr. Jadelyn Nakamura. Dr. Nakamura is the research coordinator for the Hawaii Pacific Islands Cooperative Ecosystems Studies Unit. She provides support to parks and programs in their use of cooperative agreements and works collaboratively to advance science and research in parks. She had began her career as an archaeologist with the U.S. Army Garrison's Hawaii Environmental Program, from 2000 to 2019. Jade was the Integrated Resource Manager and Archaeologist at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, where she managed park projects, published her findings, and engaged in public outreach. Jade, thank you for joining us, and I will let you go ahead and introduce our panel.
Thank you, Larry. Aloha, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Pacific Islands Climate Change webinar. The Pacific Islands region includes 12 parks, 9 on 4 of the main Hawaiian islands, 1 in American Samoa, and 2 parks in Northern Mariana Islands. Today we'll hear from a panel of 4 individuals who combined have dedicated over 50 years working with the National Park Service, with the majority of their time in the Pacific Islands. Each panelist has a unique perspective on climate change, the impacts of which we are seeing from the top of the highest mountains to the deep ocean, encompassing all of our communities in between. I'd like to introduce our first panel member. Dr. Ryan Monello is the Program Manager of the Pacific Islands Inventory and Monitoring Network. The network monitors the water, vegetation, climate, and wildlife in 10 national parks located in American Samoa, Hawaii, Guam, and Saipan. Ryan has worked for the MPS since 1999 and held prior positions with the MPS Wildlife Health Branch, National Park of American Samoa, and Rocky Mountain National Park. Ryan's talk today will examine the population trends of forest birds in Hawaii volcanoes and Haleakala National Park. He will discuss recent trends in light of ongoing emerging threats to the rare endemic bird species in these parks, along with a suite of management strategies being pursued to ensure their persistence. Welcome, Ryan.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay and see my screen?
You're good. Thank you.
Yes, we can.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for joining, everyone. Excited to talk to you about some recent work we have and some future work that we hope to do, and hopefully give a little bit of reason for optimism as well, given some of the things we're seeing happen in the forest bird community. So this cover slide is of Kipahulu Valley in Haleakala National Park. It is one of the most intact and remote west forest areas in the Pacific. It's very difficult to reach. It's all by helicopter access, and it's a critical area for several of the forest bird species that we'll discuss today. And I just wanted to give you a visual of that. We'll return to it in a little bit, but this will be the area we're focusing on. So if you're not familiar with the history of Hawaiian birds, it's an excellent example of adaptive radiation. About 5 to 6 million years ago, a single founder species led to the evolution of 55 unique species to Hawaii. Unfortunately, more than 50% of those are extinct to this point. However, we still have an amazing suite of species, many of which are still numerous in their existing native habitat in higher elevations. So we have some good numbers to work with conservation-wise, and focus our future efforts on, hopefully prevent further extinctions. So there's 3 primary threats, but the one I want to focus on is the last one listed here, and that's non-native disease and climate change, specifically avian malaria. So avian malaria and mosquitoes are not native to Hawaii. There were no mosquitoes in Hawaii, and there was no avian malaria. And over the course of all of those birds evolving into unique species, they lost all tolerance to avian malaria for the most part. So we've seen a number of extinction of bird species that we suspect was largely related to avian malaria, which was introduced in probably the early mid-1800s with mosquitoes. And what's happening here is we have these huge elevational gradients, particularly on Maui and the Big Island, where we have Haleakala National Park and National Park of Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. And so because of the elevational gradient, mosquitoes and malaria have not made it to some of these areas where birds reside. And that's where the native forest bird community exists. So if you look here between kind of this sweet spot, above the line where mosquitoes are, it's too cold in this area, but below the tree line where there's still habitat is where we have most of the native forest bird species that still exist. Unfortunately, with time, we know that what will happen is, sorry, I accidentally keep hitting the mouse button too many times. And with time, we're going to see temperatures increase, particularly in those mid to upper elevations in Hawaii, and we're going to see mosquitoes inhabit those areas as well as malaria. Malaria is a really interesting pathogen in that, we know that it has a thermal tolerance. So, for example, it has to reach about 13 degrees Celsius or about 55 degrees Fahrenheit for about 86 days of the year as a minimum temperature. And in order for mosquitoes and malaria to persist in these areas, and currently these areas are too cold for that, but we've already seen a warming trend occurring faster than expected in these areas, so it's only a matter of time before mosquitoes move up into the existing habitat. And we can look on Kauai, which is a lower elevation island. It only goes up to about 5,200 feet to see evidence of this already occurring. So this is EEV. It's an endemic species to the state of Hawaii. and you can see that it's declined by about 90% in the last couple of decades on Kauai. It's not extinct there yet, not locally extinct at least, and it still exists in good numbers in the Big Island and on Maui. But you can see the trend is pretty unmistakable, and this is attributed to the fact of malaria arriving in these areas. And so this map shows the Hawaiian Islands, and you can see this is Kauai, where we're talking about. It's one of the older Hawaiian Islands, and as you move towards the Big Island, you'll see that elevations increase. So on the Big Island, we have a couple of mountains that are over 13,000 feet, one of which is encompassed in Hawaii volcanoes, and then we have Haleakala, where we have Haleakala, which is over 10,000 feet on the island of Maui. And so we're going to zoom in here just as a quick example to give you some tangible results and see what's happening. We're going to look at Maui, and we're going to look at Kipahulu Valley here. So this is the area where that first cover slide was from. And you can see it's this valley that's running right through here. And so this area is critical bird habitat, as well as some of the adjoining areas around the park. But this is where we're going to focus our rest of our talk on here. So in 2017, the Inventory Monitoring Program, along with the park, the state, and other folks such as Nature Conservancy, worked together to conduct the first global estimate in over 30 years for some of the endemic species in East Maui. And this is where the endemic species of Maui reside. This is the only place really that they reside anymore. And so we did all these transects. These different color codes just show the last time they were run prior to 2017. But our work in 2017 included all of them at the same time, so we could get a single estimate and also come into agreement on where we're all standing in terms of numbers and next approaches and urgency. Because there was some disagreement among the agencies. So one of the best things about this collaboration is that we're all on the same page now. We've published the same report, working on the same peer review publications, and there's widespread agreement, and it's leading to really nice collaborative efforts in terms of how to address this issue with disease. So I want to focus on two endemic species native to this area. So this is kiwikiu, it's the Maui parrotbill, and currently we estimate only about 150 birds left in the area. It could be a little over 200 at most. Just concentrate on this wide graph here. This is the density over time. The way we make these estimates is we use point counts to make density estimates, and then we extrapolate based on the inhabited range. And we can see what's happened over the last 10 years or so is a sharp decline, and it's been very steep and very relatively quick. And we see the reason for this is because of the contraction in the range. So this is the black line here represents the range of this species through the 80s and 90s. And then over the last 10 years or so, we've seen this contraction, which is outlined by the yellow line here. And what is interesting about it is it's almost all upward in terms of range contraction. And that's consistent with avian malaria. And so like Kauai, we don't necessarily have carcasses in hand showing that they died of avian malaria, but we're inferring that because we have not seen a new predator introduced to this system, and because we've been doing good habitat work in these areas, the primary thing that's most likely to have changed is avian malaria. And so since these surveys in 2017, we've been doing additional follow-up work to really get after mosquitoes and malaria to see if we can confirm that or not. And I'll talk about that in just a second, but with a koikoi, the crested honeykeeper, this is another endemic Maui species. There's more of them, which is nice. There's 1,800 of them. But what's interesting about it is there's actually a smaller range for this species. So if you think about a disturbance like a hurricane coming through and potentially having a really deleterious effect on one of these species, they're both highly vulnerable to that kind of disturbance. And you've seen their density over time. If you just look at this top graph, this is the range-wide density. It's decreased quite a bit over time. And we've seen a more than 50% reduction in this species as well over the last 5 to 10 years. And again, we see the same range contraction, where if we look at the black line here, we're seeing the inhabited range known in the 80s and 90s. And if we look at the purple line, we see almost all of it is moving up in terms of where they're detected. That's probably because mosquito-free or malaria-free zone is shrinking. Actually, mosquitoes might make it up ahead of malaria, but malaria being the key piece has that strict thermal requirement, and so it's coming up the mountain a little bit more slowly. So what are we going to do? And this is where we're feeling a little bit of hope for the first time in a while. The last species to go extinct in Hawaii, last forest bird species, was in 2004, and there's really high motivation to not let this happen again. And we know we're on a very difficult situation with the parrot bill in particular, but even if we were not accomplish our objective there, we think that these actions will help the remaining native forest bird species that still do exist in these areas. So there's several tracks that you can take in terms of dealing with mosquitoes and avian malaria. And the Big Island, actually, the county of Hawaii, sponsored this workshop where they brought in experts from around the world, from Europe, from MIT, all these really knowledgeable people on the state-of-the-art work that's going on with controlling mosquitoes and controlling it in human areas, for example, where dengue fever is an issue. And we came away with a couple of conclusions from that. Clearly, conventional methods such as pesticides are not going to solve the problem and have a host of other issues with it. But the goal here is to either eliminate avian malaria or its vector. And there are new solutions where we do think we can control mosquitoes, both locally and then eventually at an island-wide scale. So if we can just get these birds to the point where we do eliminate mosquitoes on an island-wide scale, the effort to keep mosquitoes that actually becomes relatively minor over the long term, and there's some real hope that we'd have a very sustainable forest bird community. And these forest birds, for example, can exist anywhere in the island. So, you know, they're not limited by temperature. They're only limited by temperature because that's where the malaria is not occurring yet. So, you know, EV, for example, which are only found in higher elevations, if you were to eliminate malaria, you'd see EV, you know, making their way down by the coast again. So there is habitat for them. And what we're focusing on right now in the Park Service, through the SEC grant, we worked with the park and we were able to get a grant to start providing infrastructure to support this effort. We're working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Maui Forest Bird Recovery Group, a whole bunch of different people to collaboratively get Wolbachia mosquitoes on the ground. And by Wolbachia mosquitoes, I mean talking about mosquitoes that you can rear and transfer a form of bacteria that's known as Wolbachia from another insect into mosquitoes, and it actually renders all of their offspring inviable. And the cool thing about it is you can potentially do this without even introducing anything new to the environment, because you could take a Wolbachia from a native insect, put it in non-native mosquitoes, reduce the population size. There's also this weird effect, we don't entirely understand it, but it can also prevent transmission of avian malaria between mosquitoes. So there's several trials of this, US and beyond, in Australia, in really human-dominated areas, and it's showing really good results. So we're looking to push it out to the ecological side. We are still developing the tool, and then we've got an entire regulatory and public engagement piece that's part of it. But this is where we're heading to control mosquitoes on a wide, on a landscape scale, so that we can preserve these forest bird species. And I'll just wrap up really quickly. I think this is a really interesting example because there's really good scientific certainty here. You know, in ecology, we have a lot of uncertainty sometimes. We know if we don't do something here, we're going to get malaria in these areas and the birds will become extinct. We still need to do traditional methods because they can stabilize bird species in the short term until we get to those new solutions in place. Public engagement is going to be key. So far, initial efforts have shown that the public is generally more supportive of something like Wolbachia as opposed to gene drive. We're not even thinking about something like gene drive yet. That's many years away, but Wolbachia mosquitoes could bridge the gap. And then finally, there's other efforts going on. This year, there's a collaborative effort on East Maui to introduce kiwikiu, the Maui parrot bill, into new areas, establish new populations. And in some species, we're doing captive breeding, for example, with the species on Kauai, but that's not possible in all cases. So the Maui parrot bill, for example, for decades has been tried to breed in captivity, but they just don't produce viable offspring. So we've got to deal with them in their place. But the cool thing is those ones that have been attempted to captive breed are going to be part of that translocation effort. So we'll have to not take as many species from their existing range, and we'll be able to supplement it with these captive bred birds. That's all I have. I just want to point out the really large partnership for all this. It's one of the best things about working on this topic and trying to stay optimistic about it too. So thanks everyone, and I'll stick around if there's questions at the end.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Our second panel member today is Mr. Mike Gawel. Mike is currently the Chief of Natural and Cultural Resources for the National Park Service in the Mariana Islands. He has been with the MPS since 2010, but has a long history of coastal management in the far Pacific, as well as Sri Lanka, Thailand, Ecuador, Fiji, and Kiribati. Today, Mike will summarize the park's cultural and natural resources, identify climate change threats to them, and describe the steps that's being taken to respond to these threats. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I really appreciated the previous excellent talks. I'd like to present some information on our park in Guam that shows how we have very unique resources here, natural and historic resources, that are threatened by impacts of climate change, and show some example of what we're doing in response to that. My slide isn't advancing. Yes. The parks in Guam and Saipan are the westernmost of all the U.S. national parks. You know, it's like 8 in the morning Wednesday here. We're across the date line from you. And we're located approximately 3,800 miles southwest of Hawaii, as shown on the map, and even closer to Japan, maybe 1,500 miles from Japan. Next slide. Sorry, and slide slip up. Yeah, at our park in Guam, we have 7 different units as shown on the Guam map with the yellow outlines of our units. These are all chosen to have areas that were critical to the Battle of Guam during World War II, when the U.S. forces retook the island from the occupying Japanese forces. The maps on the right show our park areas outlined in yellow. You can see that there's deep ocean in the blue included in the park, and shallow light green areas adjacent to that are shallow coral reefs that fringe the whole island. And these reefs are the areas where the landings occurred during the invasion of Guam in the war. Just briefly, some aspects of that invasion where there's a huge bombardment for several weeks before the U.S. forces landed and kind of softened up the area. And from the aerial photos, where the shallow reef is on the left, you can see bomb craters, and the land on the right, also bomb craters in the area that was softened up for the attack. When the troops landed, they crossed the shallow reef with heavy equipment, tracked vehicles, and really devastated the land, as well as all the damage that was done to the coral reefs. They even blasted over, I think it was, there were more than 1,000 obstacles on the reef that the Japanese had put up in defense that were blasted by Navy demolition divers before the landing. Now, within the park, we have historical resources that are, of course, critical to our mission. They include caves and pillboxes, including pillboxes that are right at water level to protect from the invasions over the reef. And we have a wall commemorating the names of the thousands that died during the war in Guam. As I pointed out before on the maps, our natural resources go from the deep ocean, across the shallow reefs, through the shorelines, and up into the highlands. Our terrestrial resources include habitats like the beach strand, of course, and we have the limestone forest that's unique to the Mariana Islands, a type of habitat here. Also, we have grassy savanna lands that were sites of a lot of the battle work occurring during the Battle of Guam, where the Marines advanced up the hills of the savannas to the defensive points of the Japanese up above. We also have a mahogany forest within the park area. Climate change threats to these historic and terrestrial resources are listed here. The sea level rise and storm waves will cause flooding of coastal historic structures and the habitats of the native species. infiltration of salt water into the coastal habitats occurs. And that will also destroy vegetation by damaging groundwater sources. The loss of the infrastructure through especially storm wave actions will occur, and access ways to the park areas can be wiped out by these storm waves. In fact, we lost our entire headquarters and visitor center following Typhoon Pongsanwa in 2002, where waves went right through our building, which is located along the shore. And so it increased intensity of storms and actually the impact they'll have influences what we'll do in future developments in the park and how we'll manage our resources. In Guam and the Marianas, precipitation change isn't predicted to be very much over the next century. Temperature increase is more important and will have great effects. And as noted before, the sea level rise can be very disastrous to a lot of the low level areas, including the lower coastal areas in Guam, but also the neighboring islands, many of which are atolls with highest points usually about 2 meters. This is causing an influx of migrating populations that are seeking refuge from this impacts of climate change. Now I want to concentrate on my specialty, which is coral reef resources. And here in Guam, we have some excellent coral reefs. They've recovered very well since 75 years ago in the battle that caused a lot of damage. We have a huge variety of species. The biodiversity is great. For example, well, in this picture, you'll see we have the clownfish on the right. We've got several species of those here. We have over 400 species of coral, and these are all really special conditions in Guam that we need to manage. Our impacts to the coral reefs from climate change are listed here. Of course, the sea level rise and the storm waves. Also, the ocean acidity increase. There is much more research needs to be done on its impacts on our coral reefs, but it does limit the calcium that can be deposited in shells and corals. And finally, the ocean temperature increase, which causes bleaching of corals, is most critical concern we have and what we're focusing on, and I'll talk about now. The healthy coral reefs, as in the upper left illustration, are decreasing. We're losing the health, and it is obviously tied to temperature increases in our ocean water. On the right upper picture, you'll see some bleaching coral, some of our staghorn coral, and we've lost acres and acres of it over the last few years through bleaching because of the rising temperatures of the ocean. The little chart there shows 34 °C at the time of that picture. When the water temperatures remain over the normal 30 to 32 degrees for days at a time, the zooxanthellae, or algae in the corals, are expelled, and these are critical. The algae provide food for the corals, and they stimulate the growth of the coral skeletons. And so the coral gets bleached and looks white, although the living coral animals could still be alive. On the lower left, there's a picture of some of our staghorn coral in the park that was bleached out a few years ago. And if the temperatures remain high for too long a period, the algae will not recover in the corals, and the corals actually die. And the lower right picture shows some corals we were measuring that had been killed in the previous year, and they're covered with algae growth. And this growth of algae prevents settlement of new coral colonies. Not only does the bleaching affect corals, but it affects other animals on our reef, including the giant clams. And I've got pictures here of our healthy giant clam, and then one that was bleached back in our episode of high temperatures in 2016. For response to these climate change impacts, we're following this pattern of doing a monitoring process and assessing the impacts, and then projecting the future changes. And we also included a lot of education on scientific findings. And then we actively are restoring damages, or and actually looking at resilience to support that restoration. As an example of our monitoring, these are daily temperatures that we've taken on our shallow reefs back in 2016. And you can see on the graph, there's some really high points. For example, the temperature over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty much unheard of, but very damaging to the reef organisms. We use hobos or monitoring devices to measure the temperatures and the depths and light that affect these coral bleachings. Some projections for Guam on climate change impacts. The upper two pictures show past trends, and the lower two are projections for the future, which are changeable month to month, really, I think, as we get more information. The precipitation projection at the lower right indicates that we don't expect much of a change up until the year 2100. And perhaps on the terrestrial areas that will show that we won't have a great an impact on the habitats there. But for the temperature projection on the left, this is liable to cause severe impacts where it will increase. And particularly the increase in the ocean temperature is going to have some great effects on our coral reefs. As we collect this data on the impacts of the climate change, we educate about it. We use various venues, like at our visitor center, we have touchscreen videos explaining the climate change and its impacts on the park and its coral reefs. We also run camps in the summer for youth and teach them about the impacts of climate change and how to manage for it, and get them involved in actually doing some of the scientific work and collecting data. And we also have many events where we reach out to the public throughout the year to express this information on climate change and its impacts. For our getting near the end here, our coral reef restoration, I'd like to emphasize that as this process goes on, we're assessing the bleaching damaged areas and the species that are damaged, and identifying bleaching resistant strains of species. And we've been able to identify these over the last 5 years as we've had bleaching episodes. Then we're culturing selected strains of the corals asexually from fragments and growing them out in marine nurseries. Then we can harvest the cultured pieces of the coral from the nurseries, and following that, outplant the resistant cultured colonies in appropriate habitats, and then continuing to monitor and evaluate the results. And I'll show some slides emphasizing these. And we hope to expand the restoration that we've been succeeding with. The coral nursery, here's a sample of some of the biologists working on culturing these staghorn corals, many of which suffered from the bleaching over the last few years. And taking parts from the grown out in the nursery, they're outplanted on to select areas of the reef, and particularly where there are damaged habitats or where we see that there's potential for good growth of the corals. And then we monitor outplanted corals like this and see that they're healthy and growth. We have expertise here in Guam on diseases of coral, which has been a problem with transferring corals in other parts of the world, like Florida. But we have a pretty good handle on that, I think, to not run into problems with it. And for resilience, as the end of my talk, we're looking at the resilience of areas that should be focused on for the outplanting and protection of our corals. And a program or a project called Human and Natural Drivers of Coral Reef Resilience to Climate-Induced Coral Bleaching in Guam is underway now. It was actually supposed to be preliminarily presented yesterday, but they postponed it till December. We'll have more information on this resiliency and apply the results of that to any of our future restoration. And again, the data collected in that is still not final, and so I really shouldn't emphasize it. But it looks very promising that there are areas where we will be able to restore the coral and it will survive with the projected conditions and based on our past experience, especially over the last few years. I'd like to thank help I've had on this with our intern, Brittany Tomaszek, and our biological technician, Ashton Williams, and of course, my superintendent, Barbara, and some pictures supplied by the University of Guam, Professor Lori Raimundo. Thank you all, and I can answer questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mike. So our final panelists today are Stanton Enomoto and Melia Lane-Kamahele. Stanton is the Senior Program Director for the U.S. Department of the Interior, Office of Native Hawaiian Relations. He heads the Honolulu-based office and oversees the management of the department's work with the Indigenous Hawaiian community. Stanton has nearly 30 years of government and private sector experience in Native Hawaiian cultural affairs, policy planning, and resource management. Most recently, he worked for the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program and the Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative, where he provided strategic planning and climate change adaptation guidance for natural and cultural resources managers in Hawaii and the U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands. Melia is a career employee. She has been with the Park Service for more than 30 years and has held a number of leadership and management positions at various locations in the Pacific and Western United States. Melia has served on a variety of international, national, and regional and local committees and working groups focusing primarily on GIS, biocultural resources management issues, and park planning. She is active in Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander issues related to management and policy. Stanton and Melia will discuss the Resilient Hawaiian Communities Initiative, a project that assisted two Native Hawaiian communities, Kailapa on Hawaii Island and Wai'ehu Ko on Maui. They helped them engage in forward-looking resilience planning. Each community prepared their own resilience plan and identified priorities and strategies for their collective implementation.
Okay.
Melia and Stanton.
Thank you, Jade. We're sliding over here to sort of tag team this presentation, and let me bring up our presentation now. So just to give folks a little bit of background on the Resilient Hawaiian Communities Initiative, it started in 2016 through a Service First, under the Service First Authority within the Department of the Interior. We were invited to submit a grant proposal, and so working with the Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative, we cobbled together a proposal looking at really trying to build capacity for Native Hawaiian communities, sort of coming at this notion of the NCA4 from the human perspective, from the social, the community perspective. How can we help them interpret and understand and embrace and implement many of the recommendations that were coming out of the NCA4? So with that, we put together a grant proposal that sought to help communities develop community resilience plans to respond to extreme environmental events, whether they be flood, drought, wildfire, etc. What can they do to respond? And in the process, we sought to bring together various government, federal, state, local government agencies, Native Hawaiian organizations, as well as local partners to increase, this greater efficiency of working together in order to support our communities. So we assembled, we were fortunate enough to receive the grant. We assembled a project team. We established 4 co-leads to oversee this effort from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, my office at Native Hawaiian Relations, National Park Service, and the University of Hawaii. We then hired on a project manager to oversee the implementation of the project, Solutions Pacific. They then brought on both a legal fellow and a resilience specialist as under contract. And then we established a working group of various Native Hawaiian, state government, not-for-profit, as well as federal organizations to help provide the subject matter expertise in the implementation of this project. So with all the partners together, we established or initiated a solicitation of interest. So some of the goals that we sought out with that effort was that it was really to be community-led. We wanted communities to define themselves either by geography or as a community of practice. For example, it could be a community of fish pond managers or it could be a practice of hula practitioners that would assemble. We left it really open-ended and deliberately so. And we wanted also those communities to define what resilience meant to them. You know, oftentimes in scientific research and other things, you know, the academics define what resilience means, but we really wanted this to come from the community. They're the ones that are going to be implementing, living this stuff, so we wanted it to come from them. And kind of the third area I think we thought was important was this notion of net resilience gain. We received a number of proposals. Some communities were much further advanced around resilience and helping their community adapt to climate change. Others were just getting off the ground. They just barely had a community organization together and didn't quite know what to do. So we looked at this notion of how can we apply this grant funding to help increase or have the greatest net resilience in gain. So advance those that were already ahead or help those that really needed the push from the bottom. So with that, we ended up through our evaluation process, as Jade mentioned, selecting two communities. One, Kailapa Homestead on Hawaii Island in Kauai High, and the second at Waiahuko on Maui. Just a quick note, both of these were Hawaiian homesteads under the Native or Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920. Just a little bit of background, Congress in 1920 set aside about 200,000 acres for the rehabilitation of Native Hawaiians, and in that process held lands in trust to lease to Native Hawaiians for residential, agricultural, or pastoral purposes. So the two communities that we worked with are two kind of residential communities within the broader Hawaiian Homes Trust. So just a little bit of background on Kailapa Homestead. It's on the island of Hawaii. It encompasses about 10,000 acres in the northern part of the island. It's a mixed-use community composed of residential areas in yellow, agricultural areas in green, and sort of commercial use areas in red and purple. In terms of elevation, it ranges from the coastline sea level on the left side of that photograph up to 5,000 feet on the right side. Annual rainfall correspondingly in the lee of all of our Hawaiian islands is very dry. So it's about 5 inches along the shoreline up to 150 plus inches on the upland slopes. So the Kailapa community is a relatively new community there in kind of the left side of the photo, and it encompasses about 150 homes and houses about 600 residents. And they have a self-governing body, a community association, as well as a board of directors. In terms of the planning process, they really started out with this notion of trying to organize the community, bring folks together around this idea of what are our shared values and priorities that they established through previous efforts. Then engaging subject matter experts looking at future conditions, whether it's rainfall, temperature, sea level rise, et cetera. What can that community anticipate going forward? They also sought out learning from other communities. Here, representatives from Kailapa went to the island of Molokai to engage fish pond practitioners as well as others, resource managers, and really understand what it means to be more connected to the environment and how to respond to environmental change. As a result of that, they then organized themselves around developing priorities and strategies, and then went forward about assembling a plan to really take themselves into that next future. So,
Melia and Stanton, this is Larry. I'm going to bust in here for just 1 second, just to tell our participants, we know that we are running a little past time. We're good with that. We're going to continue on. I know that you both have just a few more slides to run through, so I think it's really worth paying attention here and following through with the rest of the presentation. For those folks that are attending that have hard outs, we understand that that's the situation. Just know that we're recording this webinar in its entirety, and we'll be making it available to folks after the fact for viewing if you want to catch up on the last few. So, Melia, Stanton, sorry for the interruption there, but I just wanted to make that clear before people started to depart. Carry on.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate that. I wasn't too sure how fast I needed to talk. But in any case, we'll get through this as quickly as we can. Like you said, we have a few more slides. But just to kind of talk about some of the results that came out of the planning effort at Kailapa, they did assemble a resilience plan, which they refer to as Ehu Ehu Ikapono, or Thrive in Balance. There's a HTML link if folks are interested in reading the plan in full. But what they identified in their planning process were really three areas that were important to them. One is vai, or in Hawaiian, which means water, fresh water. The photo that you see there on the right is one of the main drainages that cut through their homestead community, and it just happens to be at a flood stage. So they're really concerned about extreme events. And here we have an extreme rainfall event that brought down a lot of sediment, a lot of erosion from the uplands into the marine environment, which they access for their livelihood. So we have sedimentation on reefs in addition to sea level rise, ocean acidification or ocean temperature rise, coral bleaching. We also have potential for sedimentation effects. So they're very concerned about what this looks like, how to mitigate and restore the uplands to minimize sedimentation, as well as provide freshwater resources for their livelihood and subsistence agriculture. The second area that they were concerned on and wanted to focus on is this notion of aina, which in Hawaiian means land or environment or that which feeds. So they looked at a planning process that was stratified by elevation. So as you can see, kind of the colored areas on the right there, it goes up, from the habitation areas up to watershed management and the higher lands where water can get in, be captured, stored, and help irrigate the lowlands. The third area had to do with people. Obviously, adaptation is an inherently human response. So they had to and are seeking to build capacity within their communities, the next generation. How do they inform their children about the changes that are going to be occurring and have greater connectivity to their environment? So moving on to Maui Island and Waiahu Homestead. Here, again, island of Maui, it's a very different environment, much smaller, only 20 acres, 20 plus acres compared to 10,000. It's located in West Maui. It's even a newer homestead, constructed in 2005, one of 4 subdivisions you can kind of see there going across. It encompasses about 115 homes, 400 residents. And similarly, they have a community association and board that kind of governs that community. Elevation range, again, very low lying, but not right at sea level, 70 to 100 feet. And annual rainfall, again, in West Maui is much more, wet in the sense that, 30 inches a year. So the planning process that they undertook is very similar to Kailapa in that they really sought to raise awareness around climate change, again, engaging the subject matter experts on our working group. They also, which was a little bit different than Kailapa, went out and brought their community out into the land surrounding their homestead, and really wanted to engage folks and trying to understand what the resources are there. They went through a community asset mapping exercise. They also went out and tried to identify the environmental threats to that area, in this case, particularly flooding. There's been a number of extreme rainfall events that did impact their community pretty heavily, and assess those areas of vulnerability. In sort of the foreground of that photo, you can see the main access road that connects their community to the broader areas of Maui. And in some instances, that access was blocked. So that was a point of concern for them. And then they stepped forward in looking at, what are the adaptation options that we as a community can undertake, and try to organize that and develop strategies for their community response. So they really, in Waiahu, sought to bring the community together, get people to start knowing not only each other, but the lands surrounding their homestead. And then organize and start taking action, identifying the key stakeholders, decision makers that they needed to engage to implement those strategies. So they called their resilience plan Waiahu Maka'ala. Maka'ala in Hawaiian means to be aware, alert, observant, sort of the situational awareness, what's going on around you. So they assembled not only a written document, but they put together a number of videos that highlighted their activities and their strategies. And you can see the link there on the bottom that will connect you to that. In terms of strategy identification, they came away with two big points. One, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is the management of that drainage system. It's not just relying on the county of Maui to take care of them, but really start for them as a community to engage adjacent landowners and start doing things themselves. This is a community action sort of movement. And relatedly, the second was management of the undeveloped land surrounding their homestead. So here you see a photo of former taro lands. There's a little bit of a kind of a cultivated field in the foreground. It's restoring that. Not only does kalo provide a food source, a traditional food crop for Hawaiians, but it's also sort of a erosion or floodway, a sink, if you will, for floodwaters to collect before running off into the ocean. So it not only, it serves two purposes, food security as well as erosion mitigation. So these are the kinds of strategies that the community really sought to engage to improve their resilience. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Melia to share a little bit of lessons learned and close us out.
Thanks, Stanton. I think one of the first things we observed is there was a high degree of interest. We did have 14 proposals that we ended up prioritizing, rating, and ranking. We did have a challenge developing a set of criteria in order to do those evaluations. And I think one of the things we also looked at wanting in that criteria and the process was how to target communities that we could help advance and help build their own resiliency planning and engage, as opposed to merely moving along somebody else's process that was already partly in place. Oh, there we go. The other observation that we found was that communities needed to be engaged in their own activities. They needed to lead them, they needed to own them, and they needed to develop and plan. And we could provide technical support to them and help them understand the mechanics of climate change and the data and all the scientific side, but really they had to absorb this in their own ways and figure out how to bring that message home to their communities. And I think that was very, very challenging. The other piece that we found was limiting, partly because of planning and our own execution of this, was that by the time we got through identifying communities, developing criteria, selecting communities, and dealing with the challenges of contracting among multi-agencies and a change in administration, and just getting some community engagement. Communities themselves on the ground probably had somewhere between 8 and 10 months to actually execute and complete the reports for their projects. I think the other thing we have observed is that the working group, the technical subject matter expert group, was vastly underutilized, and I don't know if that's a function of the fact that we couldn't get people out on a regular schedule, or that the communities were not comfortable reaching out, a lack of familiarity, and I think just the challenge of numbers and getting large groups of people. We had a group in the working group was about 20 individuals, and so coordinating with people on the ground, coordinating with the project managers, I think we probably could have done a better job with some of that. I think we've also found that there's a continued challenge remaining engaged with these communities and figuring out how to continue to provide them support. We have reached out through Kailapa with the Alakaukai National Historic Trail. We do continue to provide information about resources for grants or funding opportunities. They have, within the communities, there's been turnover with staff and community members, and so that's created some hiccups, and I think a continuing challenge for us to stay in touch and help these communities continue to move their plans forward. So I think it's been an important process. We've had challenges, we've had some great success. This has been an opportunity to see two communities grow their own, home grow it, learn it, live it, engage people, places, their protected places, and their multi-generation community engagement planning that everybody from young to old is involved in, and they feel connected to their very special places. And so it's been really an amazing and very humbling opportunity to be part of that.
Great. Agreed.
Melia and Stanton, thank you so much. I appreciate that presentation. And we have, unfortunately, reached the end of our time today. So if you'd like to continue the discussion, we invite you to follow up with all our presenters and panelists as appropriate. In fact, they've graciously agreed to have their contact information shared. And we'll follow up in email to all of our participants today with that information should you want to ask additional questions of them. I'd really like to extend our sincere gratitude to all of our presenters and panelists today. Thank you so much, as well as those who have worked behind the scenes to make this particular series happen. And for those of you that are still with us, just know that as soon as we end this broadcast, a pop-up is going to appear requesting your response in a very brief survey. Please go ahead and fill that out. Your responses help improve each of these offerings as we go forward. And in the days ahead, again, you'll expect to receive a follow-up email from us with links to the recorded webinar, contact info for our presenters and panelists, etc. As a reminder, we'll be holding additional roundtables for each of the remaining NCA4 regions. We invite you to join those discussions as well, or see recordings of past iterations of this series over time. And again, we'll place a link for that into our chat box. Thank you all very much for joining us for today's roundtable, and we'll leave you with a quick reminder of your takeaways from the Pacific Island chapter of the NCA4. Thanks again to all of you for hanging in there, and have a great day.